Hi, I'm Pete and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. In this video I'm picking up right where I left off in the last video. Remember, we had just finished renovating our old house at the end of 1999. Now, things got busy for me at work right after we finished the house. I was working on a project that would take me 8 years from start to finish at my architectural firm. And I was working 7 days a week, bringing work home on the weekends, working all weekend. I was putting in a crazy amount of hours while we were settling into our new house. I had this thing back then for about 15 years where at the end of every year I would look back and I wanted to be able to say, I accomplished this big task, whatever it was for that year. So in 1999, it was the house. In 2000, I was made a partner of the firm, and that was a huge accomplishment for me. It was something I'd been wanting to accomplish really ever since I started at the firm in 1993. In 2001, things started to quiet down a little bit at the firm. The big project I was on was starting to enter construction, and I had time to get back to building. And the next thing I did was I built the little shed that you also see in a lot of our videos because we needed some place to store the lawnmower and things. And it was great. It was a great little project to get going on construction again. And I had all these little projects around the house, outside of the house, inside of the house, putting the floors in on the second floor. And I built a front fence because in all the old pictures, the house had a picket fence around it. So I built this really long fence out front and just kept motoring along with these projects, putting in perennial beds, flower beds, just fixing up the property. We were starting to build our family too. My oldest daughter, Cora, was born in 2002. My middle child, Grace, was born in 2006, and my youngest, Henry, was born in 2008. By the time 2003 rolled around, I was itching for another big project, and this time I wanted to do it all myself. I wanted to build a new building, and I really wanted a workshop and a place to put our cars inside, and I was starting to think ahead to when we got older. I wanted a place to be able to put an apartment in case Hillary and I ever wanted to move out of the house and our kids wanted to live in the house, we could move out to the apartment. So I started building our garage. This was going to be a big project and I planned on doing it all by myself. I wanted to have a 2-car garage with a second story and then a lean-to addition on the side of it that would be my workshop, which would be a combination wood shop and mechanic shop. We still had some of the old farm buildings scattered around, and there was a little, what we called the pig pen, which was just this little shed. We used to grow pigs in it when I was a kid. That had to come down first for the garage. I had to clear out a bunch of trees that had grown up around where the old carriage house was to make a spot to put the new garage in. At this point, the only thing I really couldn't do in construction was the heavy earthwork at the beginning and the pouring the foundation. So I hired a company, and they did a great job. They came in, they leveled off the site, they took off the topsoil, they poured the footings, and then they poured the foundation walls. I wanted to build this garage right, so we ran the foundation walls down 4 foot to frost depth and started building up from there. This was a cool project because unlike the house renovation, I got to start with a blank slate. So what made this house so difficult to work on is nothing was square and I had to take all the old stuff out before I went back with new stuff. Well, here I was starting with this nice level square foundation and the framing was so much easier than the old house was. It went up pretty quickly. And just like the old house, I figured out ways to do the work single-handedly by myself. I like working by myself. It's really therapeutic for me. And I was spending my day job, I was still working. I was driving to Syracuse every day and working and coming back home and doing this in the nights and evenings. At work, I was managing a lot of people and I'd really had enough of that by the time I got home. So I liked going out and working by myself. I managed to frame up all the floors and the walls by myself. And then I got my dad to help me for a morning to put up the trusses. We put them all up by hand and it was on from there, sheathing the building. One of the things that I remember is I had the picture I'm showing you on my screen at work as my wallpaper, and I remember thinking at work as I was working at my computer, boy, I'd really like to be home doing this instead. And I think that was probably back in, when was it, 2004, that I really started thinking about an alternative to my office job. The garage took me 2 years to build, from the spring of 2003 on to when bad weather set in at the end of the year. I got it all framed up, I got the floors all laid down, I got the roof on, and I got the sheathing on. And then I spent the summer of 2004 putting on the board and batten siding, which was made out of pine, and painting the building. Hillary had an old Subaru at the time, and she gradually, as I was building the garage, would park the car closer and closer to the garage door that she was going to be driving the car in. And finally, after I got the floor and the roof on, she drove the car in. She had a place to put her car where it wouldn't get snow on it in the winter. To power the garage, I ran an underground electrical line out from the panel in the basement of the house. And I did all the wiring in the garage myself, and I found out, you know, wiring on a residential level is really simple, and that gave me some confidence for what was to come, which was the house addition. With the garage finished, my tractor collecting hobby started. I had always wanted to restore old tractors ever since I guess I was in college, and I started dragging home tractors one by one, starting with the F20 and then the Super A, the 1020, the H. They just kept coming and coming, and now I had a workshop that I could pull them into and do restoration. So that kept me busy for a while. In 2005, I started planning for the addition on our house. Back when we did the house renovation, I had always thought I would put on a wing to replace the kitchen wing that I'd torn down. And when we did the renovation, we put in a temporary kitchen in the old pantry. It was a really small kitchen. We made a small dining room out of one of the bedrooms. It really wasn't optimal. We didn't really have an entryway. You just walked in kind of the back door of the house, right into the middle of everything. So I'd always planned on having an addition, and it took me a long time to come up with a design that I liked. Being an architect, I fussed and fussed over the details, trying to decide exactly what would fit the house and what we needed. But by the end of 2005, I'd figured it all out. Over the winter coming into 2006, I made a cut list of all the materials that I needed. I went through all the drawings that I had made and came up with an exact list. This is everything that I need to at least get it dried in with the roof on and the framing up. And first thing that I did when the weather cleared in the spring of 2006 is I ordered everything from the local lumber yard and had them deliver it. And I used the Super A to actually take the lumber that they delivered and pushed it into the garage where it would stay dry. I wouldn't have to worry about any weather damage while I worked on the addition in the coming years. But Hillary lost the spot for her car, unfortunately. She didn't have it very long. Once the weather broke in 2006, I had the same contractor come back that had done the foundations for the garage to do the foundations for the addition. And this addition would have a full basement, a nice 8-foot clear height to the ceiling in the basement, because I wanted to make that habitable space with a TV room and lots of natural light, and just make it feel like it's someplace you wanted to go instead of just a dark basement like we had underneath the old house. And then up above that basement would be a dining room, a large kitchen, a mudroom, and a pantry. And that would really be all we needed as a family with 3 kids, because Henry was on the way. He was born in 2008. The contractor got started and dug the hole. They pulled out that old cistern that I talked about in the last video, and boy, they had a heck of a time getting out. That thing was solid. They had to remove some big old tree stumps too. The big oak tree that I cut down, remember that I mentioned that I used for the first floor in the house? That stump was still there, and there was this giant old horse chestnut tree, which a slab of it hangs in our dining room now, that my great-grandmother planted, that sits exactly where the back porch would be on the house. The tree was slowly dying, had been for years, so it needed to come out anyway. The contractor was really efficient with their work. That's one of the things I loved about them. Dig the hole, pour the footings, pour the foundation walls. Then they waited until I was ready for them to come back and pour the slab in the basement after I had everything dried in. I remember the day that they finished their work, and I came home from my job, saw that the foundation was finished, and the first thing I did was I went out to that lumber pile that I had in the garage, got all of the sill plates out and started putting them on the anchor bolts on the top of the foundation walls, and away I went. With the experience that I'd had framing up the garage, it really didn't take me long to frame up the first floor, get the plywood down, frame up the walls. I got my dad's help for a little while, setting the rafters, putting the plywood on. This was a breeze. By midsummer, I had everything enclosed, all the sheathing on, the roof on, and I started to work on the outside. And for the outside, well, let me first say, when I designed this, I really wanted it to be in keeping with the style of the original building, so I made sure to follow the language, the columns and the pediments and all the moldings of the Greek Revival style. So when I started on the outside, I already had that language that I'd used on the old house to go around and trim out the way that, kind of like the old kitchen wing was made, and went around and did that, and it went really fast. By the time the weather turned bad that fall, I had the outside of the addition done. All of the molding and clapboards and painting was all done. It looked finished from the outside, but the inside, again, was an empty shell. So as that winter started, I started working on the plumbing and the heating for the addition, and just like the original house, we went with radiant heat in the floors of the addition, which has been such a blessing downstairs in the TV room. Radiant heat and concrete floors is the best heat source. I learned as I went along. I learned plumbing, I learned how to sweat copper. Again, it really wasn't that hard. Once you read about it first is what I did, try it and refine it, and it's not hard. It was really nice learning those trades. The wiring I'd already learned for the garage. We put a sub panel out to power the addition that was off of the main panel in our old house, and I wired up all the circuits from that. At the same time, I was roughing in the plumbing, the electric, and the heating. I was building the interior partitions. There really weren't a lot of them. It was a pretty open addition, insulating the addition. And one of the highlights of this portion of the project was when it came time to put up drywall, which is a lot of work. Drywall is pretty heavy. My two uncles came over as well as my dad. So it's my dad and his two brothers, and we hung all the drywall in a day, the four of us. That was pretty cool to have them all together working with me. When I designed the addition, I wanted it to be a bit of a contrast inside from what the old house was inside. So in all these old houses, things are really chopped up. Every room's got a door to it, mainly I think for the winter time, so that you can isolate different rooms in the house to keep them warm. I wanted the addition to be more open, and one of the principal ideas for openness was to put a cathedral ceiling in the dining room, which is the biggest room in the addition. And as I got into thinking about all the little details that make a building special, that make it memorable for you, I kind of latched onto the idea of using found materials from all the structures that we had tore down to bring some of my family history into the addition. I mentioned that slab of the horse chestnut tree that my great-grandmother had planted, but there were things that I did also in the structure. So when I framed up the cathedral ceiling for the dining room, the cross ties that go between the rafters, I used reclaimed rafters from the carriage house that we'd torn down when we first moved here, and used the knee braces from them that had the pegged construction, because that was a post and beam structure and everything was hand pegged together, had hand carved pegs. I used them as a reminder of what stood here before. And I always liked the warmth of exposed wood, so I used a lot of it in the addition. The cathedral ceiling in the dining room is tongue and groove pine beadboard. I used pine wainscoting around the walls of the dining room. And for the big opening that is between the dining room and the kitchen, I salvaged some of the beams from that carriage house and made the opening out of them. There's so much character in them, these big old oak beams. And for the wall that is in between the old house and the addition, which originally had clapboards on it that I took off during the construction, I used the old hemlock siding that I had salvaged off of that same carriage house. And oh, as an interesting aside, I mentioned the mud sills that I tore out in the old house, the old chestnut mud sills. Well, some of them were in good enough shape where when I cut through them, I could count the growth rings. And if I figured back from the time that the house was built in 1870, those trees were alive actually when Columbus sailed to America. There's just so much history, it just blew me away. It made me feel like a small part in the big history of this place. For the floors in the addition, I was a little more impatient than I had been in the existing house. Cutting down a tree and drying it into lumber you can put on a floor took me about 3 years at a stretch to air dry it and then house dry it and get it planed and all that stuff. So I went out and I bought pre-finished oak flooring for the addition, rented a power nailer. I had hand nailed and screwed all of the boards for the floor in the existing house, rented a power nailer for the addition, and put that wood down in I think 2 days. It was so much easier. Now all through when I was building the addition, there was a door, our old back door, that opened into the addition, and I'd put a barricade across it to keep Cora and Grace, our 2 little kids, which were toddlers at the time, from wandering into the addition and falling in a hole or something. Well, they would stand over that, or they would look over that partition and see what I was doing whenever I was working. After I finished putting the finished floors down the addition, I let them loose. I opened that door and out they came. They had these little cars that they would push around with their feet while they were riding on them, and they made laps around that floor again and again. It was great to see the family finally getting to do something inside all this work that I had done for the past year. As winter turned into spring and 2006 began, I continued working on finishing out the inside of the addition, and I got the dining room to a point where we could actually move our dining room table in there, and we started eating in the addition. The kitchen wasn't even close to finished, but throughout the construction of the addition, we kind of gradually moved in, just like Hillary was gradually pulling her car into the garage. We gradually started occupying and using the new space. I ordered custom solid cherry cabinets for the kitchen, and of course there's quite a lead time to get those made. So during that lead time I worked on the pantry. Off directly adjacent to the kitchen is a pantry, and I built all the shelving for that in my workshop out of maple and installed it in there. The cabinets came, I installed them, and we had ordered a granite countertop for them as well. The countertop guys came and measured for the countertop and finally put that in. So at this point, the upstairs of the addition done, and we were in the summer of 2006 now, so I've been working on it for about 1.5 years. With the top floor done, I moved down into the basement and started finishing that out, and I had a bunch of ideas for how to make the TV room more meaningful, just like I had the upstairs. The first one was I left the existing fieldstone foundation wall exposed where the addition intersected with the existing house. And there's an interesting thing about the way they used to build these houses. Above grade, you see that the outside are fairly flat stones, and they made an effort to keep them all in a plane to look more finished. Well, once you go below grade, they just kind of stacked rubble up, and it's a very unfinished surface. And I thought that character was really cool. So I went through and I repointed that whole wall and left it exposed in the TV room of the addition. I installed the vinyl floor in the basement, which looks like real wood. I rather would have used real wood because I like natural materials, but with concerns about moisture, that's the way I had to go. For the wall behind where the TV would be hung, again, I used salvage materials. I had more beams from that barn, which I used to kind of frame it. And then for the middle section, I used chestnut, which I had salvaged from the original floorboards in the old house. And I built a temporary stair going down to the basement just out of 2x lumber. The post that you see in the corner, this is actually its third life. So that post originally was in the carriage house that we tore down, but even more originally it was in some other building because everything else in that carriage house was sawn lumber. You could tell by the marks on the outside they were sawn with big round saw blades. This was a hand-hewn post, which indicated it had come from before approximately 1850, maybe even earlier than that, when there weren't a lot of these big circular sawmills around. So that's actually this post's third life. Eventually, the temporary stairway you see in the photo would be replaced with a stairway that I built using some pretty complicated joinery that was made out of the second half of the old oak tree that I talked about for the first floors of this house, and the stump had been ripped out for the addition. I left all of that wood live edge with the original wavy edge on it from when the tree was grown, and built the stairway out of that. In the fall of 2006, we moved into the basement TV room, and I was pretty much done with the addition. Of course, there were a million things, little things left to do. But from that point on, we turned our focus out to our lawn and started putting in more flower beds. We put in a pergola that you see in a lot of the videos with wisteria growing on it. And it was smaller jobs. There were a few finishing touches that needed to be put on the house. And the first was the shutters. Shutters make an old house, in my opinion, and this house had real shutters on it. You could close them, you could latch them with hardware on the windowsill. You could open and close the louvers to let light and air in, and I wanted to duplicate those. I shopped around for some reproduction ones, but none of them were authentic. So while I was working on the house and doing other things, I developed really fine woodworking as a hobby, and it equipped my shop with all the tools necessary. So I decided to recreate the old shutters that were on the house. There were only a few that could be salvaged. Most of them were rotted out. So I made patterns out of the ones that I could salvage. I used mortise and tenon construction. I actually cut each louver individually out of red cedar, put shaped the dowels that go on the end of each one, put them in the side rails so that they would work up and down, put the right reproduction hardware on them, mounted them on the house, and that makes the appearance of the house, in my opinion. The other thing I did was the front porch always had a railing on it. It wasn't there in my lifetime, but all the old pictures showed it was this just kind of gingerbready ornamental railing. So I studied the old photos and I made a reproduction in my workshop, again out of red cedar, that matched the profiles exactly as I could. And these little touches are what make an old house. Shortly after I finished the edition, a local magazine contacted me, and they were doing a special issue on the homes of architects, and they wondered if I'd be interested, and I said sure. So the reporter came down, and I think that she was just a little taken aback. She had been to other architects' homes that were all modern and slick and upscale, and here was my little house that I'd done myself and was pretty humble compared to what she had seen before, but she seemed to take it all in stride. They came and took photos and wrote a nice article about it. Some interesting anecdotes and stories running through this whole process. So I started the old house in 1995 and I finished the addition in 2006, so that's 11 years. Over the 11 years, a lot of interesting little sideline things happened. The first is when I tore apart this old house, and I was in everywhere, you know, everything was exposed. I didn't find a single scrap of writing anywhere, and that amazed me. The only writing I found was from a renovation, a very slight renovation that happened, I think, just a few years after the house was built. When they put the chimneys in the bedrooms, they closed in some of the windows that were on the gable ends of the house. Well, on the boards of one of those windows, I found the date that that renovation had happened. Also, interestingly, I found nothing in the walls. No coins, no newspapers, nothing. I was amazed. I kept looking. I thought I would find all kinds of things from my family history, but there was nothing. And one day when the ground was all torn up around the house, the general contractor was regrading all the lawns, a man stopped by with a metal detector in his trunk and said, "Oh, I like looking around old houses like this for artifacts." And I said, "Sure, you can go ahead." Well, he spent all morning here with his metal detector going through around the house. He went through the dirt floor in the basement. He found absolutely nothing except for a 10-cent piece from the 1890s. Proof that my family was dirt poor all through its history. And one big thing I learned through all this is you don't need fancy tools to get the job done, which is one of the reasons I kind of get annoyed when people comment and they say, "Oh, you need this and you need that," and I respond, "I don't need that, I get along just fine." I hand hammered all the nails in the original house and the garage. I did that all with a hammer. I did it all with very few specialized tools. I had a miter saw and a jigsaw and a circular saw and a drill and not a lot of other equipment. A plumb bob was, you know, amazingly helpful. No laser levels, none of that stuff. Later on, when I built the addition, I said, well, I think I've had enough of this hand hammering, so I bought a framing nailer, a finish nailer, and a roofing nailer. But hand hammering, there's nothing wrong with it. It's more of putting yourself into what you're doing. I opened this video with saying that this was one of the principal things that determined who I was and my attitude toward life. And I can't stress how rewarding it is to get up in the morning, walk through the house, walk out the back door, walk past the garage, the garden fence that I built, all this stuff that we made, and remembering what it was like when we moved here 20 some years ago and started all this and put our own sweat and labor into it, and wound up with something that was so much cheaper than if we'd gone out and bought it or hired somebody to do it. And it makes us want to care for this place a lot more, which gets back to my point I made a few videos ago that I think this world would be a whole lot better place if people invested more in the place they live, not only their house and things, but their community and how they get along with their neighbors and other people. I think it would help to solve a lot of the world's ills if people just talk to each other more in person rather than on the internet. I guess the only thing that I really haven't told you guys about is what happened between 2006 at the end of the addition to 2013 when I left my farm. And what happened is I was looking for a new hill to climb after I finished the addition, and I found it in my work at that point. I started a new studio at my firm which focused on the things that I talk about, place and understanding place and healing place. And it was related to green design and sustainability, but I developed this funky kind of philosophy that was a lot beyond that and got into more about the way we think about buildings. So that kept my mind occupied for those years. At the same time, the feelings that had started really when I was building the garage 10 years earlier kept simmering to the surface, and gradually they're what led me to leave my job in 2013 and start a whole new adventure with the farm. You know the story from there. I hope you've enjoyed this series of videos, and I'll be back to the farm for the next one. I'll see you then.